All right, welcome back. And we're in week 2 and 3. We're going to put them together. I'm excited for this week. Just enjoyed time with the Lord, going over all of this, and had a blast. And I'm excited to share. So we're going to dive right in, right into the bowls. He says, "Then I saw another sign in heaven, great and marvelous, 7 angels who had 7 plagues, which are the last, because in them the wrath of God is finished." And so we've seen a progression from like the seals, and seals were slow and spread out, and then we had the trumpets, and we'll look at how the trumpets just affected a third of many things. And now we're finally at the bowls, and the bowls are severe, and they're so severe. It says the wrath of God is finished in them. And that kind of reminds me of when Christ was on the cross and he said tetelestai, and it was finished, right? It is finished. The payment was paid in full through him. And now we'll see the wrath of God finished. We see all the people in heaven and they sing the song of Moses. And this brings us back, this imagery back to Exodus, after God parted the sea and delivered them from Egypt. It also just kind of brings back the thought of Moses and the Exodus. All of the plagues that we saw Pharaoh go through were sort of a shadow, really, of what we see in the bowls, a lot of them. And one of the 4 living creatures, these are the creatures underneath the throne of God, gave the 7 angels 7 golden bowls full of the wrath of God, who lives forever and ever. And the temple was filled with smoke from the glory of God and from his power. And no one was able to enter the temple until the 7 plagues of the 7 angels were finished. Again, do you remember when we were studying about the trumpets, and right before the trumpets came out, there was a half-hour silence in heaven? Here we're seeing that almost magnified. The seriousness of the bowls is so much so that nobody can enter that temple until everything is finished, everything is completed. So the first one, and they seem to come really quick. The first one is that all of the people on earth, it strikes earth, and the people receive boils all over their skin. And we're kind of reminded that in the trumpet, when that one struck the earth, that only a third of the earth was burned up, a third of the trees were burned up, all the green grass was burned up. So in this bowl, we're just seeing more of a devastation of human beings and boils. It also should remind us of Pharaoh, how in Egypt, all of the people who rejected God, who followed Pharaoh, they also had boils covering them. The second bowl is poured into the sea, and the entire sea becomes blood. It kills every living thing. And looking back at the trumpets, remember, that time only a third became blood, only a third of the creatures died, and a third of the ships. So again, in the bowls, it's just much more severe. And then you also see the rivers and the springs turn to blood. In the trumpets, only a third of them were harmed, and that was with wormwood. It was a poison. It made the water bitter, and so people died. Also, the water turning into blood, we can go right back and look at Pharaoh and how the Nile was turned into blood there too. What's interesting is that after these 3 things happen, the people curse God. They blaspheme his name. So it just shows us a couple of things. It shows us that they know God is causing it, and they openly rebel, refuse to believe in him, hate him, call him names. They blaspheme. The fourth one that happens is he allows the sun to scorch people. And what's interesting is that the bowls seem to come very quickly. And so the people still have boils on their skin. So on top of having boils, now they're just being burned and scorched on top of that. And I just thought of like your most severe burn that you ever maybe had as a kid, a sunburn. So imagine that like on top of your boils, how painful that would be. And people, this just drives them crazy, and they just curse God now for what he's doing to them. And when we look before at the trumpet, that time it was just a third of all the light sources, so the sun, the moon, and the stars being darkened. So much more severe in the bowls. The 5th bowl is aimed at the throne of the beast, and it turns his entire kingdom to complete darkness. And I've never experienced complete darkness like that, but I know some people have talked about going into maybe the Linville Caverns or I think somewhere, and they turn off the lights in that cave and how it's just pitch darkness, and it's really incredibly frightening. And so we see this in Revelation 2. It's so frightening that they begin to gnaw their own tongues in anguish. So just imagine that they have those boils, they've been burned and scorched, now there's no light, and it's incredibly frightening, and they're gnawing their tongues. The trumpet that we saw that kind of goes along with this, it talked about locusts being released from the pit of hell to torment people for 5 months. So this time the torment is different, but the place it comes from is the pit. And we're reminded that the beast, the Antichrist, comes from the pit. His power comes from Satan. So it all sort of ties together. And then it was sort of interesting that the sixth bowl is poured on the Euphrates River. And so it dries up the river completely, and it says this is so it can make a way for the kings of the east to come and assemble. And let's just look at the second woe, the sixth trumpet, also is at the Euphrates, and that was when the 4 angels there, these demonic beings, were released to kill a third of mankind. Remember, they had this army of 200 million demonic beings. So now we're seeing an army of human beings gathering at Armageddon, and they are going to be fighting against Christ. It says, I saw coming out of the mouth of the dragon and out of the mouth of the beast and out of the mouth of the false prophet 3 unclean spirits like frogs, for they are spirits of demons, performing signs which go out into the kings of the entire world to gather them together for the war of the great day of God, the Almighty. Behold, I am coming like a thief. Blessed is the one who stays awake and keeps his clothes so that he will not walk about naked and people will not see his shame. And they gathered them together to the place which in Hebrew is called Harmageddon. And that means hill of Megiddo. We would say Armageddon. And that's sort of the great battle that everybody always associates with Revelation that's going to come very quickly. And what's interesting is that last time we studied how Christ comes and the angel, and they take their scythes and they harvest the fields of the earth, the people. Remember, we talked about how all of the people against God are assembled at Armageddon, and that Christ is going to trample them like grapes, and that their blood is going to flow for 200 miles. So this is the same thing. We see that unclean spirits go out to deceive these kings, but we have to remember that God is allowing all of this. God is pulling the strings of this whole orchestration of this whole thing. And it's just sort of fascinating to see that this is how it's sort of coming about. The 7th one is poured out into the air. And so before we talk about that, let's just look at the trumpet. It said, the kingdom of the earth has become the kingdom of our Lord and of his Christ. And in the 7th trumpet, there was lightning and thunder and hail and earthquake. In the 7th bowl, it says, there was flashes of lightning and sounds and peals of thunder, and there was a great earthquake. You see how it's magnified? Such as there had not been since mankind came to be upon the earth. So great an earthquake was it, and so mighty. The great city was split into 3 parts, and the cities of the nations fell. So think, Jerusalem split into 3. Every single nation, gone. It's fallen. Babylon the Great was remembered in the sight of God to give her the cup of the wine of his fierce wrath. And every island fled, and no mountains were found. And huge hailstones weighing 100 pounds each came down from heaven upon people. And people blasphemed God because of the plague of the hail, because the plague was extremely severe. So we just see greater magnification, total destruction. That just amazes me that this time every island has fled. There's no more islands. They haven't just been shifted out of place. They no longer exist. And same with mountains. It's just as we drive through these beautiful mountains in North Carolina, I always am thinking, wow, one day this is going to be just flattened. God is just going to flatten all of this. And it also shows us again that people are blaspheming God. And I think that's something we really have to realize is that at this point in history, they know exactly who is doing all of this, and they curse him. There's hatred there for him. And then we look at, make sure I didn't go too far, I did. He says, then one of the 7 angels, so he kind of has taken us very quickly through the bowls, and I think that is also to sort of show us that it's going to be kind of quick, one right after the other, it seems like. And then he says, one of the 7 angels who had the 7 bowls came and spoke with me, saying, come here, I will show you the judgment of the great prostitute who sits on many waters, with whom the kings of the earth committed acts of sexual immorality, and those who live on the earth became drunk with the wine of her sexual immorality. And so we see that he's calling her the great prostitute, and we've looked at before how when God refers to Israel even being a prostitute, it means that she knew about God, and Pastor talked about how in Babylon, they knew that God was real, and they turned against him. They worshiped other things other than God. So that's being a prostitute in the Bible. And apparently she's spread that to all of the kings. Everybody is worshiping other gods, demons, and they're just drunk on the wealth that she has and the riches that she has, all of that. And on her forehead a name was written, a mystery, Babylon the Great, the mother of prostitutes and of the abominations of the earth. So this is a mystery. Babylon is supposed to be a mystery, which Pastor explained this morning. What's interesting is that this is written on her forehead. So far in Revelation, we've seen the 144,000, and on their forehead is the seal from God. And we've seen people who follow the Antichrist, and on their forehead or on their hand is written the seal belonging to the Antichrist. She has her own seal, and she is called the mother of prostitutes and the abominations of the earth. And we're going to explore that. I put this quote in here. It says, if you don't know history, then you don't know anything. You're a leaf that doesn't know it's part of a tree. And I know that might be a little offensive, but I love it because that totally described me. Like in school when I was a kid, we had to study all these dates and memorize all these things. And I never liked history. And I was always like, how does this relate to me? Why is this important? Why do I care about this battle? Why do I care about this date? And the truth is, it's because I was never given a really good reason. People just said, we study history so we don't repeat it. Well, I was 12 years old, and I was like, all I've done is study the repetition of history. That's all we do is we, out of pride and arrogance, we get in a war, and we just keep repeating history over and over again. And then when I saw this quote, I was like, that's it. Because the truth is, if you imagine all events of history as leaves, what are they connected to? The purpose of them is God. God is the tree. And so when you start realizing that God is actually the one who creates history, when you realize the whole purpose of history is from Genesis to Revelation, that God is moving all events, that all events are connected to him, and they're all pushing us toward, the second coming of Christ, then it makes sense. And now I'm fascinated by history, and I want to go back and I want to study because I can see how even the Civil War and Revolutionary War and World War II, all of that stuff is connected to God's purpose. So we should know our history. And I read this book once, and it really fascinated me that the Bible history, the history of the Jewish people, that's our history too as children of God. We've been adopted into the family. That's our history. The earth is the Lord's, and it all contains the world and those who live in it. For he has founded it upon the seas and established it upon the rivers. That's where our history begins. He created it. And we know our history. I'm not going to go through it, but we know about Adam and Eve and that they were kicked out of the garden. And we know the story of Cain and Abel and Noah's Ark. These events are so important to the history of God because out of Noah's Ark comes the history of Babylon. Out of Noah's ark comes the bride of God, Israel. That's how he describes her. And we've seen her with the 12 stars on her head, and she stood over the moon. He uses women to portray sort of the history of these two cities. And that's what they are. They're political and they're religious centers. They're both. And it's interesting because Babylon, just as Pastor was talking about this morning, can be found in every single political and religious thing that has come up since then, right? I mean, you could see all of that woven into all of history. And we're going to explore that for a minute. So, Mystery Babylon. So let's just look very quickly. We know that Noah had Ham, and then from Ham came Canaan, and then Nimrod. And we know that Nimrod set himself up against God. And we don't have to go into all of that because there was such a good job was done on that this morning. But Nimrod is the one who really becomes the center of, we looked at in your homework, all of the cities that he built, including Nineveh. So he is a person who is powerful, who creates many cities and creates many cities that stood against God. And Nimrod has this pride in him that kind of harkens back to Lucifer. And so I want to take a quick look at what we do know about Satan from the Bible. And there's an interesting chapter, and this is our history that we should know about. If you look at Ezekiel 28, if you have time this week, just read it. Very briefly, at the beginning of Ezekiel 28, basically the Lord is sending Ezekiel to warn the king there of Tyre, because he is so full of pride. He's arrogant, actually, just like Babylon in Revelation. He thinks nothing can destroy him, that he's incredibly wealthy, that he's done it all on his own. He's a bully, really, of other countries around him. All of his people are full of pride because they're such a wealthy place. And so basically the Lord sends Ezekiel to tell him that his destruction's coming. What's interesting is about halfway through that, it switches to God compares his pride to the pride of Satan. And we learn some things about Satan in there that's interesting. It's helpful. We learn that he was full of wisdom. He was perfect in beauty. He had the seal of perfection. He was covered in precious stones. In fact, he was covered in 9 of the 12 stones that the Jewish priests wear on their vestments. 9 of the 12 stones that are in the foundation of heaven, of the new Jerusalem, the new temple that will come down. He was created out of 9 of those stones. So he's a beautiful creature. He was placed in Eden, the garden of God, and he was actually placed right on the holy mountain of God. He's called in Ezekiel the anointed cherub who covers. So it possibly could be indicating that he guarded God's presence. So what went wrong? It says, through your widespread trade, you were filled with violence and you sinned. So I drove you in disgrace from the mount of God, and I expelled you, guardian cherub, from among the fiery stones. Your heart became proud on account of your beauty, and you corrupted your wisdom because of your splendor. So I threw you to the earth. I made a spectacle of you before kings. He was so full of pride. It seems that he wanted to be God, and so he convinced other angels to rebel with him. His end is also described right after that. He says, by your many sins and dishonest trade, you have desecrated your sanctuaries. This reminds me in Revelation, all of the people worshiping him, all of the people who will be worshiping him and his demons. So I made a fire come out of you, and it consumed you, and I reduced you to ashes on the ground in the sight of all who are watching. All the nations who knew you are appalled at you. You have come to a horrible end and will be no more. And we will see that at the very, very end when he's released. You'll understand this later. You'll see him being thrown into the lake of fire. So we see that this pride that really began, in Satan, how he passes that along and eventually even to Nimrod, pride leads to disobedience and rebellion and rejection of the Lord. So Nimrod, And I just wanted us to sort of be anchored in that as part of our history. So Nimrod builds Babylon, and it's interesting. He builds it out of brick that were fired. The Bible purposely says it. They fired the brick. Why would they do that? It makes it waterproof, right? You can't just do like mud bricks, because if it waters again, if God floods the earth again, it would all turn into mud. And he puts bitumen on there, which also makes it waterproof. So it's an absolute rebellion to God. And so he builds Babylon the Great. She is the mother of prostitutes and of all the abominations of the earth. Let's look at that. Mother of prostitutes. We've talked about how this is idolatry. It's false religions. Abominations of the earth. This comes from bedelugma. It's the Greek word. It means to reek with stench that is disgustingly abhorrent and detestable. It's a moral horror that is like a stench to God. For example, when people refuse to hear and obey his voice. And what do we see in Revelation, right? What do we see all through time? We see people who refuse to hear him, who refuse to obey him. This is Babylon. This is where it all sort of starts. So if you take those two, it transcended into the false religion of Babylon was they came to worship Baal or Baal, however you like to pronounce it, and he was the sun god. And it's believed by many people that actually Nimrod was sort of he got people to worship him, and then his name became Baal or Baal. There's also Ishtar. She was the goddess of love and fertility that was believed to be Nimrod's wife or mother. And then Rhea was the great mother of the gods. Now, I want you to watch this because it's interesting. This is where we sort of get this false religious beliefs, because in this picture, it shows God comes down and he scatters them. Well, look at this chart of where all of them are scattered, all the different tribes at that time, all over the world. And what do you think they take with them? They take with them their false religion, and it just sort of morphs and grows into other things. So in Egypt, it's really interesting. They still have a sun god there. They name him Ra. They have a goddess of fertility. She becomes Isis, very close to Ishtar. And they have over 2,000 gods and goddesses that they worship. The Canaanite culture, same thing. They keep the name Baal. He demands worship of Molech, which is child sacrifice. A lot of Jews participated in that eventually. They sacrificed their own children to Molech. Then you have Ashtoreth, very similar to Ishtar. And then you have Atherat, the great mother of gods. And they also have multiple gods and goddesses. And we don't have time to go through each one, but it's just amazing. Phoenician culture, Greece, Rome. And I even remember studying that. I hated studying all those gods and goddesses in school. I remember just saying to, my teacher in high school, why do we have to know all these names? And why do they just, Rome just comes in and they take all the Greek gods and they just give them different names? And that he in particular used that to sort of point to, religion's just made up. But it's fascinating that it wasn't. It all stems from Babylon. And I find that amazing. And you can see it go right up to present day. Many peoples, many faiths. And I think if you look at every faith, you could trace it right back to Babylon. And he carried me away in the spirit into a wilderness, and I saw a woman sitting on a scarlet beast full of blasphemous names, having 7 heads and 10 horns. We're going to look at that beast. We've seen this beast before. Let's make sense of it. And God tells us what all of these things mean. He says this calls for a mind with wisdom. The 7 heads are 7 mountains on which the woman sits. They are also 7 kings. So these are kingdoms and kings. If you look back, you can see that there were 7 empires that attack Israel, that either take them captive or scatter them. The first one was the Egyptian Empire, the Assyrian Empire that took the northern half, the Babylonian Empire took Judah, then the Medo-Persian Empire, then we have the Greek Empire, and John is living in the Roman Empire. The 7th one is going to be the revived Roman Empire. This is going to be the kingdom, what will become the kingdom of the Antichrist. She has been in, when she's sitting on that beast, what is God saying here? She is influenced. We've just gone through all the false religions, the political powers. She's influenced all of those political systems, all of those religious systems. Then he says 5 have fallen. Well, all of those empires, by the time of John, they've all fallen at that point. So we can cross off 5 of them. He says 1 is. Remember, John's living in the Roman Empire, so that's what the one that is. And then there's 1 that has not come yet, but when he does come, he's going to remain for only a little while. When you think of the Antichrist kingdom, it only lasts for 7 years. That's very, very short in the amount of, time for a kingdom to exist. Then he says, the beast who once was and now is not is an 8th king. He belongs to the 7 and is going to his destruction. That sounds like a riddle, right? I mean, that sounds really confusing. So you just had to sort of slow down. And the beast who once was and now is not, that's talking about the Antichrist. Because remember, we studied that he will be killed with a sword, and then he will come back as if from the dead, and he will reign. It's saying that he belongs to the 7, but he's an 8th. Those 10 crowns represent the 10 rulers who are going to, at first, run this revived Roman Empire. And remember, Antichrist comes in the beginning. He's not in full power, though, but these 10 kings are, and he's sort of the one who makes these peace agreements, and he's this sort of hotshot. And then eventually, he becomes all-powerful. They give their power to him. So he's kind of like an 8th king, but he belongs to this 7th kingdom. Do you see what it's saying there? So he's so powerful, it's almost like he's his own other category, but he's running their empire because they give all their power to him. And it tells us that he will go to destruction. So the 10 horns you saw are the 10 kings who have not yet received a kingdom. Because remember, he's talking to John. He's saying, look, they haven't come to power yet. This is in the future. They haven't yet received a kingdom, but who for 1 hour will receive authority as kings along with the beast. Well, we know from studying Revelation that it's going to be over 7 years. So this 1 hour tells us that it's going to be brief. That's what the 1 hour is. It's going to be a very brief rule. They have one purpose, and they will give their power and authority to the beast. They will wage war against the Lamb, but the Lamb will triumph over them because he is Lord of lords and King of kings, and with him will be his called, chosen, and faithful followers. And that, to me, is, again, it's just going back to showing us that we are raptured. Who comes back with the Lord? Who's the ones that are called, chosen, and faithful? That's us, the ones that have been raptured. We come back down with him. Then the angel said to me, the waters you saw where the prostitute sits are peoples, multitudes, nations, and languages. So he's showing us, what God's showing us here is he's telling us who this person is, this woman is, and it's a system that's in all countries. So she has influence and power. It's all over the world. And I chose this as the EU building. I think it's in Brussels. And they built it. This blows my mind. They built this to look like the Tower of Babel. A famous painting of the Tower of Babel, an unfinished by Bruegel. They purposely did that, and in the front of the building, that's a statue of a woman riding a beast. It's a new, I don't know what you'd call that, art, futuristic. I don't know. I can't think of the name of it right now, but that's sort of that impression of what they think that would look like. And their slogan is "Many tongues, one voice." Isn't that interesting? We are still in rebellion to the Lord. I just find that really fascinating. So God is saying that this woman is, in fact, in all languages, all peoples, multitudes. It's throughout everything. But there is going to be we see later on, there is a central city that she runs out of. The beast and the 10 horns you saw will hate the prostitute. They will bring her to ruin and leave her naked. They will eat her flesh and burn her with fire. For God has put it into their hearts to accomplish his purpose by agreeing to hand over to the beast their royal authority until God's words are fulfilled. The woman you saw is the great city that rules over the kings of the earth. So here we see that, yes, she's in all nations, but she's also this city. So it's almost like this religious belief that has spread through all people. But she also is a political system. She runs out of a city. And it's also interesting that God is the one who's in control of this, right? Like God has all of these kings sort of turn on her in the end, and they hate her, and they're going to burn her. And God is also the one who has those 10 kings give all their power to Antichrist. So we're always reminded that God is in control. God is in power. This is all going according to his plan, and he's in control of this. So what is the city where she's sort of operating out of? What does that city become like? And that city is a haunt for unclean spirits. It's demonic activity centered there. All kings, all nations have drunk the wine of the passion of her sexual immorality, and they've been deceived by her sorcery. That tells us that she is very powerful as far as a religious center, because we know that the sexual immorality, the sorcery, that's showing that these are people who know God, and she has deceived them, and she is making them drunk on idols and worshiping demons. Merchants have grown rich from the power of her luxurious living. So she's also this really great political influence. You're talking about money, merchants. So they sell all kinds of things to her. Sins heaped high as heaven. In her was found the blood of prophets, saints, and all who have been slain on earth. So she is the reason why all throughout history, you can trace it back to that sort of spirit of her. The spirit of Babylon has caused people to kill God's prophets, kill God's saints. And so she glorifies herself. She lives in luxury. She's full of pride. Remember, it says that she does not mourn. She doesn't think she'll ever be a widow. So she thinks she's above God. This city, this belief system, thinks that it will go on forever, that it's in full control. However, we see that in 1 hour, she is thrown down with violence, that plagues come to her in a day, that there's death, there's mourning, there's famine. This is all happening immediately at once. She's burned with fire. She's completely destroyed so that nothing is found in her. God's people are told to come out of her. So before any of this happens, there must be people living in her city where this is going to happen, and God warns them, come out of her because I'm about to judge her. So that kind of also reminds me of the sickle, how when God goes through and he's reaping, he reaps all of his people out. And so we see her being utterly destroyed. And it's interesting, too. It's like we see the merchants, right? And they're weeping and they're mourning. I love the picture on the bottom, the guy wiping his tears with the dollar bill or whatever, because that's them. Like they're only upset because it says they're weeping because no one buys their cargo anymore. They could care less about the people who have died in her. They could care less about her. They're just upset because they don't have anybody to buy their goods. So this whole future system is just so built on this lust and love of money and power. Kings who committed sexual immorality and lived in luxury will weep and wail as they see her burning. Everyone stands far off, and they're all in fear of her torment. So that shows us that whatever happens to her is going to be so horrific that everyone stands far away from her, and they're in fear. So when we look at Babylon, we can see her beginnings in the Old Testament, that she was born there in a sense. And we see her all through our age, all through the seals and trumpets and bowls. And then finally we see her meet her destruction. Isn't that amazing how you can put all of, human history, boom, right there? It just sort of makes the whole Bible. You can see why is Babylon so important in Revelation? Because God is taking care of business, something that started way back in Genesis that was a rebellion against him. We also need to know really quickly about the history of Israel, the bride of God, because she plays an important role too in Revelation. And remember, she comes out of Noah's Ark, and I'll explain how. It says in Ezekiel, God is talking about Abraham, and he's saying, then I passed by you, he's talking about Israel here, and saw you, and behold, you were at the time for love. So I spread my skirt over you and covered your nakedness. I also swore to you and entered into a covenant with you so that you became mine, declares the Lord God. And this is the most beautiful love story. When I was just kind of having my quiet time with the Lord, when I was looking at all of this, and of course I got sidetracked from Revelation, that's how you're getting this, because it was just this beautiful love story of God and Israel. I mean, it's the original love story. And so he finds her, that's Abraham, and he makes a covenant with Abraham. We have to remember in Abraham's time, when God's eyes are searching over the world, his eyes land on Abraham. Abraham believes in God. It was a world where people were rebelling and rejecting God, and his eyes fall on Abraham, and he chooses him. He chooses to make a covenant with him and to make Israel from that covenant. And so we have this incredible love story, so from Abraham we get Isaac and Jacob and the 12 tribes, and this purposeful, meaningful story of Joseph going to Egypt. He had to go to Egypt because they become slaves in Egypt. And when they leave Egypt, they are loaded down with gold and goods, enough to make a kingdom, right? We get the story of Exodus, which is foreshadowing all of everything in Revelation. We know the story of how they're delivered into the promised land, how they build this beautiful temple to the Lord. It's just this beautiful love story. They finally have arrived. And then we see, like all of human beings, right? There's a mess up. They play the harlot. We saw that too as they were escaping from Israel, and he punished them. Not all of them made it to the land of promise. We see, however, that it gets so bad that he divides the kingdom and he takes the top half away. He divorces them. He keeps Judah, but even eventually Judah gets separated from God too. And these are his words, and he says, then the Lord said to me in the days of Josiah the king, have you seen what faithless Israel did? He's talking about that northern kingdom. She went up on every high hill and under every green tree, and she was a harlot there. I thought, after she's done all these things, she will return to me. But she did not return, and her treacherous sister Judah saw it. I mean, he's talking here in language of a husband, and she's having an affair with him. But what is it really talking about? She went up on the high hills. She would sacrifice children to Molech. That's what those people did, right? She's worshiping other gods, and it hurts God's heart. And he thinks, oh, she'll come back, and she doesn't. And then he thinks, well, Judah will. Judah's going to see what I do to her. I'm going to punish her, and Judah's going to return to me. And I saw that for all the adulteries of faithless Israel, I had sent her away and given her a writ of divorce, yet her treacherous sister Judah did not fear, but she went and was a harlot also. And so we see this tragic, heartbreaking story. They betray the love of their life, God, and they're sent out. They're dispersed. Then he says in Jeremiah, go and proclaim these words toward the north and say, return, faithless Israel. He's begging for his wife back. It's so tragic. I will not look upon you in anger, for I am gracious, declares the Lord. I will not be angry forever. Only acknowledge your iniquity, that you have transgressed against the Lord your God, and have scattered your favors to strangers under every green tree, and you've not obeyed my voice, declares the Lord. Return, O faithless sons, declares the Lord, for I am a master to you, and I will take you, one from a city and two from a family, and I will bring you to Zion. There's a promise there. That we see that promise in Revelation, right? He's going to do this. He's begging for them to come back, but they don't. He sends his son. They don't repent. They don't return. His son dies on a cross. His son is raised from the grave. Israel does not repent or give her heart to God. That births the church age. That creates the bride of Christ. And that's where we are right now. We are all being prepared for our groom. We have another love story with Christ. So what about Israel? What about the bride of God? It's sort of just left hanging, right? The story is just not finished yet. For I do not want you, brothers and sisters, to be uninformed of this mystery, so that you will not be wise in your own estimation. This is Paul writing to the Romans. He says, he's talking to Christians, a partial hardening has happened to Israel until the fullness of the Gentiles has come in. And so all Israel will be saved, just as it is written. The deliverer will come from Zion. He will remove ungodliness from Jacob. This is my covenant with them when I take away their sins. Wow. We just got like the whole rest of the story, the whole reason, right? We've had this great love story of Israel, their rejection of God, our marriage betrothal to Christ, and then we see that God's going to come back after we've been raptured. He comes back for Israel. For the Lord has called you. This is so beautiful. This is Isaiah, and he's talking to his bride, Israel. For the Lord has called you like a wife forsaken and grieved in spirit, even like a wife of one's youth when she is rejected, says your God. For a brief moment I forsook you, but with great compassion I will gather you. In an outburst of anger I hid my face from you for a moment, but with everlasting loving kindness I will have compassion on you, says the Lord your Redeemer. Look at this on a timeline. There's Israel. We'll put her right up above Babylon. He says, in an outburst of anger, I hid my face from you for a moment. For a brief moment, I forsook you. That's right over the church age, right? He's turned from them. For God, that's just a brief moment. But then at the end, he says, but with great compassion, I will gather you. He will gather. He will come back for Israel. He will gather them in Revelation. And so in that timeline, you can see that's our history and our future all right there. This is God's great story. This is God's bringing everything in Old Testament and finding a resolution in Revelation. So if you don't know history, then you don't know anything. You're a leaf that doesn't know it's part of a tree. I love that quote now because I know my tree is God. History is not random events centered on the acts of man. History is God's story. History is an intricately woven fabric of meaningful events that illustrate, through the loving kindness and powerful acts of our benevolent Creator, His plan for our redemption and salvation. His plan to take what was meant for evil and make it for our good. His plan to give us grace and eternal life through His Son, Jesus Christ. He keeps His covenant promises. And next week, we will see after His wrath, we're going to learn more about Armageddon and the 1,000 years and His new kingdom, and we'll just wrap it all of it up. So have a good week and come back next week with lots of questions.